When you think of Fujifilm cameras, what comes to mind is typically a beautiful machine crafted with an elegant classic approach. But with the X-H2S, it just seems they've ripped their suit off and went all out on performance, and I mean it. I was in a constant state of being overwhelmed by the camera while I was working on this review, and that's no hyperbole, because if we're talking headline features, this thing has a series of them. 40 frames per second, continuous shooting RAW plus JPEG, incredible autofocus with a whole catalog of trackable subjects, 7 stops of IBIS on initial firmware, an optional modular cooling fan, and a brand new F-Log 2 profile, 4K up to 120p, open gate 6.2K up to 30p, and internal ProRes recording. Is that enough for overwhelming? From that rundown alone, it's not hard to deduce that this is the top-of-the-line hybrid model from Fuji. So very balanced feature set for both stills and video. For stills, you've got a 26-megapixel X-Trans sensor to work with, and being the latest high-end model, it's pretty much a given that you've got all the current film simulations available. Something new to Fuji bodies though is the ability to now shoot 10-bit HEIF stills on the X-H2S as an alternative to JPEGs. But if it's speed you need, then it is speed you will get with this. 40 frames per second continuous shooting in electronic shutter is real. Granted, you will need fast enough media to keep up with that, and you get about 3 seconds of buffer before you start losing FPSs. If you're shooting with the mechanical shutter though, you still get a very respectable and mean-sounding 15 frames per second. Over in the autofocus department, there is a major overhaul happening on this body. Fuji's added quite a number of categories to the subject detection list. In addition to human eye tracking, you get animal, bird, automobile, motorcycle and bike, airplanes, and trains. For each of these categories you select, the AF system will very reliably pick it up and track it. I did notice a rather peculiar pattern though, because I seriously wonder if this is what we've been training all those captures for. But the autofocus on this is definitely the best among all the Fuji cameras I've used. That's evident in both stills and video mode. It's especially responsive if you pair it with one of the LM lenses. But for a user like myself, however, over in video mode is when things start getting very serious. There's a menu I've never seen on any other Fuji camera before, and it's this movie setting list menu. It's a dedicated page for setting up your resolution, frame rate, codec, bitrate, image profile, proxies, and independent settings for external output. I love this because it's one place where you can set everything up and verify all your settings at a glance. It's also right here you'll find the setting to record 3x2 6.2K up to 30p. Now, that resolution of 6240 by 4160 is the whole sensor. You're actually getting the exact same pixel count as your 26 megapixel stills, and you get to write it to your card in ProRes. You can record internally ProRes LT422 or HQ with this, which also means you can now shoot video with film simulation in ProRes. Now, for 4K video, both DCI and UHD, internal ProRes is possible up to 60p. If you want to do 4K 120p slow motion, the footage will be slowed down in camera without sound, and you can record only in H.265. In Full HD, you can go up to 240p with all codecs available, and no matter which resolution and frame rates you're recording in, rolling shutter is very impressively well controlled on the X-H2S. So clearly, internal ProRes recording is a huge win for this camera. It instantly fits the X-H2S into many pro workflows, and for the amazing image quality the sensor is capable of producing, it is simply wonderful to have ProRes as an acquisition format. Needless to say, with 6.2K ProRes HU on the table, there's a lot of data that needs to be moved quickly onto the card. This camera has dual card slots, one SD and one CF Express Type B. It is that Type B that will be doing most of the heavy lifting, so to make the most out of this camera, you will need to invest quite a bit on some decent high-capacity storage media. But unlike the ProRes recording, some features on the X-H2S are external, like active cooling. There is a cooling fan module sold separately for the X-H2S. It screws onto the back of the body with the screen flipped out, and it draws power directly from the camera. It's got built-in contact pins for communicating with the camera, so no cables required, and you can control the fan from the camera menu. Now, bear in mind that the fan will block the screen from being flipped back inwards, so as long as you've got the fan on, your display is going to be sticking out. Now, I'm sure this fan accessory raises a few questions. Namely, do I really need the fan, and does the camera really overheat that easily? The answer is no. It's actually pretty tough to get the camera to overheat. For my worst case scenario test, I had two X-H2S's set up recording 6.2K in H.265, one with the fan, one without. The fanless one went on for just over 1 hour and 20 minutes before it stopped recording. The one with the fan didn't even display a temperature warning, which did pop out on the unfanned one at around the 50-minute mark. I did my test outdoors in direct sun, and the image from my thermal camera also shows the actively cooled X-H2S being less warm, not just around the area with the fan, but the entire camera unit in general. So for very demanding use cases, the cooling fan is very effective. But for most use cases which aren't pushing the camera this hard, it will probably do just fine without the fan. Also, while supplying power to the fan set to high speed, and while recording in 6.2K with the screen continuously on and set to full brightness, the X-H2S still gave me over an hour and a half of runtime on one single battery. That is very, very impressive for what I would imagine to be a rather power-hungry camera. And it's not using some fancy new battery, by the way. It's using the exact same one the X-T4 uses. Also, one thing worth mentioning is the full-size HDMI port on this thing. I know it sounds minor, but it makes the biggest difference in the world. The IBIS is also incredibly good. You feel like a tripod when holding still, but movement is also nicely smoothed out. It's currently at 7 stops of stabilization, but Fuji does say they plan to somehow increase it to 8 stops via firmware update. One final thing new to the table brought along by this camera is the second iteration of F-Log. This is the first of its kind to record video in F-Log 2. Now, I am testing this camera pre-release and I have not seen any documentation for F-Log 2, so everything I'm sharing here are based on my own tests. From my tests, F-Log 2 is even flatter than F-Log 1 and holds even more dynamic range. Comparing F-Log 2 against classic F-Log, when exposed using the exact same exposure settings, the shadows remain around the same levels, but you can see F-Log 2 is retaining a lot more highlights, which are otherwise blown out on F-Log 1. And when we expose for the midtones, the shadows are lifted noticeably higher on F-Log 2, so when we push those shadows back down to the same levels in post, you actually get cleaner shadows with lower noise in F-Log 2, despite it having a higher base ISO than F-Log 1. I also noticed that F-Log 2's white point is set at 85 IRE, so if you're setting up your zebras for clipped whites, you want to set them for 85%, otherwise you might lose some highlights. Unfortunately, this camera, despite having so many amazing video features, a built-in waveform monitor is not one of them. There's also one more thing that kind of bothers me on this camera. It's such an amazing hybrid, but there is no quick way to switch between stills and video mode. The video icon on the mode dial is neighboring C7 and filter mode. It's 5 clicks away from M mode. If they had their movie and stills toggle like on the X-T4 or even GFX 100S, that would be amazing. But hey, at least they give you 7 custom modes on the dial. It's been a 4-year gap between the X-H1 and this, and Fuji has unleashed Beast Mode. For me, it's the video features that really swept me off my feet, and honestly, I did not expect something like internal ProRes to be coming from Fuji. The X-H2S is a force to be reckoned with, and it is undoubtedly one hell of an all-rounded workhorse. So that's all from me on the X-H2S, and if you enjoyed this review, maybe I'll see you in another one.